Okay, hello everybody, my name is Angie Grove. I'm the director here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum, and welcome to our free monthly lecture series. For this series, we do 11 lectures throughout the year on all sorts of topics related to early American history, Vermont history, and this site here, this beautiful Ethan Allen Homestead Park, which is both a historical and an environmentally important preservation site. Okay, so I would like to, I have to get some of the logistics out of the way. So first off, I want to thank the sponsors of this program. And then I'm going to give you the date for our next lecture. So please send your gratitude from your heart to Richard and Linda Smark, whose generous donations have helped us keep this program alive. Okay, and for next month, we have one more lecture this year. It is on November 17th. It is titled How Vermont Became Iconic, From Backwater to Wonderland by Dr. Douglas Slaybaugh, who's actually here tonight in the audience too. So that'll be exciting, so please come again next month for that. Okay. Also, logistically, if we do have some latecomers, we might be adding a couple chairs right over here, so please, thank you for your flexibility ahead of time as we try to fit in a few more chairs over here. In fact, the ones we've just added, we're actually going to have to move over here so we can keep the exit aisle open, please. Thank you very much.
The next one is November 17th.
Correct.
I think that's a Monday.
Is that a Monday? Do I have the wrong date?
Yeah.
Note to self, I need to update the website. Okay, so the 16th is Sunday then.
Yeah.
Thank you. That tells me you all are paying attention. That was a quiz. That was a test and you all passed. So Sunday, November 16th. Thank you all so much. Okay. Okay, so we will have a PowerPoint presentation, so if you wanted to turn your chair that way, you are welcome to do so. Okay, we're good. Okay, so we also have one more event coming up this month, and that is our Spooky Stories event. It's called Spooky Stories at the Homestead. That is with costumed reenactors and storytellers who will tell historically factual, spooky ghost type stories from here at the homestead on a guided tour in the dark after sunset. Though there is one kid-friendly tour happening right before sunset as well. This is a ticketed event, and the ticket sales do 100% go back into our programming to help the nonprofit museum here. So please visit our website to purchase tickets for that event. That is next Saturday on October 25th. Okay. I think that's all I have to say about the museum. Is there anything I'm missing, Allie? I don't think so. Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Oh, I do have really quickly two more thank yous, though. We do have some people in the audience who volunteered to bring the refreshments tonight, so please thank you, Chris and Lee. Yeah. Refreshments always get an applause. And the refreshments will still be out after the program, so please help yourself afterwards as well. And the last thank you I wanted to give is to CCTV, also known as Town Meeting TV, a local nonprofit that helps make sure that democracy and public engagement is accessible to more people. We have Charlie here from CCTV recording the program. Thank you. And we've had a partnership with them for a very long time so that this program can later be on YouTube and available for you to rewatch, or for people who weren't able to make it tonight to watch it as well. So thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm now going to introduce one of my board members of the museum here, who will then be introducing our speaker. It is actually a name I've already said. He will be giving the talk next month. Please welcome Dr. Douglas Slaybaugh.
Well, it's a pleasure to be introducing Alexi, who joined the history department at St. Michael's a few years ago. It was actually after I retired. But I know that she's helped to keep our program going strong in the face of a lot of challenges these last few years. Alexi is an assistant professor at St. Michael's of Early American and Public History, and teaches a variety of courses. She holds a bachelor's degree from St. Olave's College and master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Virginia. Her research and teaching interests include revolutionary and early national era women slave owners and historical memory of the revolutionary era through contemporary screen media. So she has quite a wide variety of interests here. She is a member of Vermont's 250th Anniversary Commission, which is planning efforts around the state to celebrate, as the name suggests, the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. And we're very happy that she's also a board member of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. So without further ado, let's give a welcome to Angie Garrett.
Thanks, Doug. Alrighty, welcome everyone. Thank you for choosing to be indoors this afternoon, even though it's gorgeous outside. That's a huge sacrifice, so I really appreciate it. So thank you, Doug, for that lovely introduction. Like both Doug and Angie said, I am a board member here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. I'm also on one of the commissions for the Vermont's 250th, and I hadn't even told, I don't think I had told Doug yet before he introduced me a while ago, but I've gotten some really, really nice news very recently, hot off the press, that Governor Phil Scott has appointed me as the Revolutionary War historian for the state of Vermont for the 250th. For the 250th commission that he oversees. So yeah, I'm really excited to speak with y'all today. So you have come to the talk called The Losers of the American Revolution. Loyalists, what they lost, and why we should care, right? So again, I'm Dr. Alexandra Garrett, and I think we're just gonna straight dive in. We're gonna see this image later, so don't worry if you're wondering about it now. We'll see it later. On a cold winter night in Norfolk, Virginia in 1775, Penelope Forsyth, her husband William, and one of their enslaved women fled from the flames that engulfed their home and shoe shop. The rebels had targeted the Forsyths because the family did not want their colony to become independent from Britain. After fleeing, the three hid on a cramped schooner at Gwynn's Island on the Virginia James River. After Lord Dunmore could no longer promise their protection, the three fled for England, and William died at sea. The enslaved woman escaped after Penelope arrived in London. Penelope retold this story in her claim to the Loyalist Claims Commission and hoped for £580, or about $118,000 in today's US money, as compensation for her losses and terrors. Like Penelope and William Forsyth and the people they enslaved, hundreds of Loyalist families, in the Jeffersonian use of the word, suffered terribly in 1775 and 1776 in Virginia's Tidewater region. From the moment the British fleet arrived in Norfolk in October 1775 to when rebel patriots finished scorching the city in February 1776, Loyalists in the city and its surroundings had, quote, experienced a variety of hardships and dangers attended by a degree of distress for which they were much unprepared by their former situation in life, unquote. That put it mildly. Loyalists fled for their lives. They watched angry mobs ransack and burn their homes. They lost their entire fortunes, and they fought and died in skirmishes. Many finally flocked to small ships under the protection of John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, and Virginia's last royal governor, in the waters off Norfolk and later Gwynn's Island. These evacuees hoped to evade hostilities on shore. But in doing so, Loyalists risked death again from diseases spread by people living in close quarters on board. Some families, like the farmers and the Logans, lived on cramped vessels for 8 or 9 months. In addition to disease, Loyalists suffered from dwindling sustenance. Many so feared, quote, provisions growing short, unquote, upon these vessels that refugees like James Dunn and his sons went back ashore and risked further ill treatment of the rebels. In August 1776, Lord Dunmore sailed to New York City, where many Loyalists followed him. In 1780, the British burned and plundered nearby Portsmouth and other towns when they invaded the Virginia area again. Between 1775 and 1780, Loyalists with means and overseas kin networks sailed to England, Scotland, and other parts of the British Empire, like maritime Canada, Jamaica, and Bermuda. Most would never again return to Virginia. The Forsyths' plight in Virginia mirrored other Loyalist plights in other colonies throughout the American Revolutionary era, for which our purposes today is essentially the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 through the end of the war and even after the war. So let's briefly summarize the Loyalist plight, then delve into the stories of a few women Loyalists in Virginia in particular from my own research. This will help us see a microcosm or case study of what Loyalists suffered and lost during the American Revolution. Just give me a moment, I'll take some water. Throughout the entire lead up to the war and during the war itself, about 1/5 to 1/4 of the American population, or 20 to 25%, were Loyalists. So we're talking in British colonial America. The other 1/5 to 1/4 were patriots, and the rest were what's called disaffected. So actually about 40% of people during this entire wartime period were disaffected, meaning either they were politically neutral or they felt like they didn't have a huge ideological stake in the game and just wanted to make sure they were going the right way wherever the winds were going depending on which town they were in, right? Oh, we have to sign these Patriot Loyalist oaths? Sure, if that helps me keep my business, if that helps me keep my house, sure, I'm a patriot, right? Or the other way, right? So we have to remember disaffected actually was a more average experience during the war than strict Loyalist or strict Patriot believers. Only after 1775 did more people turn slowly at first towards the Patriot side, and then more so during the war. Loyalists, also called Tories, were Americans in the 1770s who did not want to separate from Britain. They would come from any walk of life, from rich landowners from important families to average laborers. Those who tended towards loyalism were the people who benefited the most in their own lives from connections to Great Britain. If you imagine a local shop owner and his job is to import manufactured goods from Britain and then sell to the American colonists, he might be a loyalist because to break from Britain would hurt his business. You can imagine a dock worker, maybe he's a sailor, a Navy man, right? Some sort of person who works on ropes on the dock. Well, maybe his job and his labor is dependent on British merchant ships coming in. What if those British merchant ships stop, which does happen later in the war? What happens to his livelihood? You can also think about the merchant class, the merchant and landing owning class as well. Many merchants were, as we said, merchants, right? So they're the ones buying British manufactured goods in bulk before then selling them en masse to shop owners and other locals, right? This is going to hurt their business as well if we break from Britain. So it crosses class, and it crosses gender, and it crosses loyalties, right? So since loyalism was strong in ports with connections to transatlantic exchange, Norfolk merchants' decisions to flee, like my work on Loyalists in Virginia shows, resembles the decisions made by many, but not all, merchants in port cities like Boston, Charleston, Newport, and Philadelphia. Most Loyalists lived in New York, Pennsylvania, and the backcountry of the Carolinas and the South. In New York in particular, Loyalists were wealthy men whose wealth depended on connections with Britain. Right? So we have high-level merchants, but we also have lawyers. We also have ministers who get their education abroad in Britain. We have imperial officials, right? Because the colonies have local governments that are, some parts are appointed by the British, right? To them, in New York in particular, Loyalists who were wealthy saw mob violence all around them. They looked at the lower class dock workers and laborers who joined up with the patriot-sided Sons of Liberty as lawless or rabble-rousers, right? So to them, mob violence is all around them, and it's a sign to stay loyal to Britain. In the backcountry regions of Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, you have large European immigrant populations, and many of them were from Scotland, a part of Britain. So many Scots liked living in the backcountry because they could keep their cultural autonomy. And to them, during the Revolution, they worried that if the government suddenly changed, That would be very bad for them since they were minorities. They feared discrimination from a new type of patriot government, since the colonial British government just let them be. Right, so you have to understand the deep hypocrisy at play here by the patriots. While they're shouting for liberty and freedom from British control, they, one, were of course still keeping slaves, as were Loyalists, but two, they were depriving Loyalists, their peers, their neighbors. They're depriving these people their rights, stripping them of their freedom and right to not be bullied simply for their political beliefs, their right not to have their home ransacked, all in the name of this so-called liberty. The patriots were hypocritical in this way, but they didn't care. It's their prerogative, right? They see bullying Loyalists and tax collectors for their beliefs as a means to an ideological and political end, and that's to have their side, the patriot side, win this war and have a new country called the United States. So something I wanted to show you really quick. Wrong one. Something I want to show you quickly is two very famous images from the American Revolution. This is one of them. This is Paul Revere's engraving the Boston Massacre. It's technically called the Bloody Massacre, but we kind of colloquially call it the Boston Massacre. This is from 1770. This is a piece of propaganda that Paul Revere, if you remember Paul Revere, like the British are coming later in the war. Earlier, he's a silversmith. He's an engraver in Boston. He makes this piece of propaganda after the so-called Boston Massacre happens, and this actually gets published far and wide and kind of gets people to join the patriot side. I won't get into it too much. It's actually really fun to point out all the little pieces that are super untrue in here, so we can do that later if you want. But my point in showing you this is that you see no Loyalists here, right? Even though there were Loyalists in Boston, and there's Loyalists any city where British troops also are, right? So this is supposed to be Boston, and on the left are supposed to be rabble-rousers who are pestering the British soldiers. So we can assume on the left there's patriots, and on the right we have British soldiers. But where are the disaffected subjects, and where are the Loyalist subjects? Forgotten about, right, in our historical memory. Same here, one of the most famous paintings in retrospect of the American Revolution. This was painted in the 1800s. And this is George Washington crossing the Delaware before his attack on the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey. Again, just pure patriots, right? Pure George Washington. We're not going to have big, famous paintings of the Loyalists, right? Because we as Americans want to say rah-rah for the patriots because they're the ones that won the war, and this is why we have the United States as we have it today. So you won't see nice, famous paintings that are rah-rah about the Loyalists, right? So in our historical memory, we just forget as average Americans today what happened to the Loyalists and why they're important during this. Also, side note, I like to tell my students, George Washington knew not to stand up in a boat. People knew you don't stand up in boats, so this would have never happened. That's just putting that out there, okay? But darn does he look glorious, doesn't he? But no, he would have fallen over, so he would not have stood up. That's fine enough. We can pretend, right? Okay. So, when you think about what the patriots were doing, especially in a hot spot like Boston, because Boston is one of the hottest cities, right, for rebellious action. They're requiring people, these patriots are requiring people to take oaths of allegiance to the new nation. If you refuse, you may be forced into exile, forced to flee the home you grew up in, forced to take your family with you, right? The patriots are not just doing bullying, okay? It's not just running some people out of town. It's also tarring and feathering of tax collectors. Tax collectors who were appointed by the British, right? Their job is tax collecting. This is a job they had been doing years before any of this rebellious activity was occurring, right? And it wasn't a problem then, right? But these are tax collectors who may have been your neighbor once. And they're speaking out in support of Britain, or they're simply collecting taxes and doing their job. Well, you might get tarred and feathered. And that's something I also like to remind my students. Tarring and feathering, it has an old tradition from back in Britain about how to humiliate someone. Both tarring and feathering, right? Feathering, you look goofy because you have these feathers on you. You have to understand hot tar can give you third-degree burns. You can actually die from infection from third-degree burns from tarring, and people did. So tarring and feathering is not just bullying. It is actually potentially killing someone for their political beliefs. Wealthy Loyalists in particular had their land stolen and sold at auction for the war effort, okay? So when you think about when localities would finally be taken over finally at the local government levels of patriots, then they need to support the Patriot War effort. They need to have land or sell land for money, or they need farm goods from a Loyalist farm to feed the patriots, right? Land is stolen, sold at auction. If you're a Loyalist and you happen to stay put in the town that was taken over by patriots, that's what happens to you, again, for your political belief. Okay. It's also these young state governments during the war that we have to think about. The thing is, they're not legal, right? Because the patriots haven't won the war until they win the war. Patriots win in 1783. So all this time, when you have new young state governments starting up, those are technically illegal state governments, as according to what the British would say. Right now, you can think, well, we're rebelling, and this is a part of rebelling, and this is a part of founding a new nation, is create a new government, right? But also, the founding fathers and other important men that we know about are actually literally putting themselves on the line, knowing that if they don't win this war, they will be tried and hung for treason and die, right? So they are really putting their lives out on the line for this ideological idea. At the same time, they're walking around, anyone walking around in these young state governments is saying they're in power, but it's about the people giving them power or not, because very, very, very technically, very, very, very legally, none of this is legal, because it's still, all these colonies are still under British control until the war's won, right? So just think about this as well. You also have patriots kind of under the Sons of Liberty as kind of the mob violence group. We have people going around suppressing pro-British newspapers, okay? So you literally have patriots suppressing free speech. Just think about that. You have patriots suppressing free speech, suppressing dissenting views, all while they themselves are fighting for freedom. Now, when it comes to fighting the war, Loyalists did fight with the British armies in the war. About 20,000, so about 20,000 loyal Americans would join up to fight in the British Army. That sometimes meant loyal Americans in the British Army outnumbered Washington's own entire Continental Army, depending on where you're at in the war. Okay, but spoiler alert, the Patriots won the American Revolutionary War, which means the British lost, which means loyal Americans also lost. Whereas the patriots who won the war felt like they got their independence and freedom, Loyalists who lost the war felt their freedoms were stripped from them. While the patriots, of course, called themselves patriots, to Loyalists, the patriots were rebels. Loyalists disdained patriots, as it was the patriots who were breaking with the status quo and causing strife in the colonies, not them, who wanted to stay with the status quo. After the war, some Loyalists were able to be welcomed back into their communities, depending on different local circumstances. In the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which is the treaty that ended the war, the British and Spain and the new United States are signing this treaty, right? In this treaty, the British government did ask the new US government to stop harassing Loyalists and indeed to return the property for them, or to them. But it was just a suggestion, right? The British can't mandate anything. They're the losers of this war. So it's a suggestion in the treaty, please welcome these Loyalists back into your communities, please stop harassing them, and please return their property to them, right? Now, on the United States side, this new country, the new United States, wanted to look fair and didn't want to look too harsh to their now new citizens of the United States. But wouldn't you know it, Loyalist property was most often, not returned to them. So the Patriots winning the war meant the ousting of an estimated 80,000 Americans. These 80,000 Americans happened to choose the losing side of a war. They didn't know that they would lose in advance, and they had to flee, uproot their lives, and move to Britain, Canada, the West Indies, or other parts of the British Empire. They were often stripped of all their money and belongings and had to start over again in a brand new country. So now I want to kind of zoom in a little bit more on my own research on Loyalist women of Virginia. Women are not seen as explicitly political actors in the same way men were, but the did not stop the wives of Loyalist men from suffering alongside their husbands for their husbands' political choices. One of the best primary sources to get at the experiences of Loyalist women is through the Loyalist Claims Commission records. So I kind of mentioned them earlier in this talk. Can we go ahead?
It is
Glitching out?
a little bit. 1 second. Because it's changing on my side and just not on your side. So I can just try this again.
I'm gonna keep talking, okay?
Yeah.
So let's keep going. All right, so imagine you're uprooted from your home, you're exhausted from some journey, you're living in a new place, and you're relying upon friends' charity. That's the plight of Loyalist refugees. They're trying to mitigate the damage that the American Revolutionary War wrought upon their lives. They do this by applying for aid from the British's Loyalist Claims Commission. So the British Treasury had been making ad hoc pension payments to refugees for temporary relief since the very beginning of the American Revolutionary War. In the spring of 1783, refugees appealed for, quote, their right to receive compensation from this government, unquote. In response, Parliament passed an act in July 1783 appointing a commission to investigate claims and award compensation for refugees damaged, confiscated, or abandoned property during the war. Claimants had 9 months to submit claims and supporting documentation to the Treasury. Then the commission could take up to 2 years to process the applications. The British government had never before accepted such comprehensive financial responsibility for refugees, a burden of millions of pounds during a period in which national debt was already at an all-time high in Britain. The Loyalist Claims Commission sources represent the single biggest trove of documents from which to discover what happened to Loyalists during and after the American Revolution. Many refugees would hire lawyers to help create and submit claims. So for many British lawyers, this work of asset reclamation becomes a full-time job. They were already adept at doing this because they were already adept at working with people from across the Atlantic Ocean. They would often never meet the Loyalist refugee who hired them to submit a claim for them. So lawyers would either interview or read the correspondence of their client, and well as read or interview that of the client's friends, neighbors, or business contacts to support their claim. The lawyer then would transcribe these documents, mail them alongside supporting papers, all the way to the Claims Commission office, which was located in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. Okay, let's see. Boom, baby. All right. Claims opened with the memorialist. So, memorialist means the claimant, right? So it's their memorial, their story that they're telling. And this is a typical start to a claim you might see in the archive. So claims opened with the memorialist's personal trials owing to the, quote, the late unhappy troubles, unquote, in their community. The memorialist would then record their current state and location and would draw a narrative line between their past persecution and their loyalty to the crown. While such expressions of fidelity were often truthful, they doubled as a rhetorical strategy to receive reparations. Claimants then provided a schedule of property, income, and debts that they had forfeited in America. They concluded with supporters' testimonials that attested to the loyalty of the claimant and the stated value of the property. So by, quote, throwing themselves upon the protection of government, unquote, through claims, Loyalist refugees anticipated that the Crown would compensate them. From the viewpoint of the Commission, only American Loyalists counted as sufferers. But that did not stop some claimants, like a Lucy Nex, who lived in Britain but had property destroyed and debts uncollected in Virginia, petition the Commission for reparation. Another claimant, a widow named Ellen Hatton, highlighted the trials that her late husband Walter endured in America with his previous wife. The latter fact, which Ellen admitted, the whole previous wife thing. She tried to hide that Walter had married her later in England by admitting the fact that she was never actually living in America. But a clerk discovered the omission and decidedly marked claimant was never in America, so that commission was rejected. So Loyalists certainly did seek to receive as much compensation as possible by attesting to their loyalty, their extreme suffering, and their heavy losses. They also offer to historians individual stories that are as different as they are detailed, that are as hopeful as they often are utterly tragic. White men from all regions in America submitted the vast majority of claims to the commission, so the gender of claimants predictably skews heavily towards men. Women appear on the claims either as family members whom men describe, or far less frequently as claimants themselves. If women made claims in their own names, they were usually widows. Married women appear subsumed in their husband's claim because of coverture status, right, or femme covert laws, right? This is in Britain and early America at the time. If you're a woman, you get married, legally your identity is subsumed to your husband. Technically, even your own children, your debts, your private property, minus 1/3, which is your widow's share, is legally controlled by your husband, right? But common law considers white adult women without husbands as femme sols, alone women, solo women. So they're the heads of their households, right? So these women are allowed to file under their own names to the Claims Commission. So in 1972, a very famous historian named Mary Beth Norton examined all 3,225 Loyalist claims to find that about 14.5% were made by adult women with claims in their own name. So for my work, I've discovered that Virginian women submitted 35 claims in their own names, which represents roughly 6% of the total claims from Virginia. So Virginia women's Loyalist claims revealed gendered strategies that women deployed to strengthen their cases to the commission. Women would emphasize their itinerancy, their dependency upon men, their sufferings at the hands of patriots, their resourcefulness, and their own views on property ownership. I want to briefly share 2 Virginian Loyalist women's plights, as described in the claims they submitted to the commission. This will help showcase women's hardship as political exiles. No, okay, we're not there. So let's talk about Joyce Dawson. Joyce Dawson's husband James had built, quote, a handsome fortune, unquote, as a merchant in Norfolk for over 2 decades. But when the rebels took possession of the town in January 1776, the rebels sought to punish James and his family for their loyalty to Britain. So they dragged James to prison. While he was there, the rebels confiscated the Dawson's house and other buildings, so that Joyce and their 2 sons were, quote, turned into the street and exposed to the severity of the winter season, unquote. But James escaped prison and, quote, found his family in great distress in a small cottage in the woods, unquote, outside Norfolk. Feeling cold, upset, scared, and having gone from living in a nice house to living to a hut in the woods, Joyce may have resented her husband for having stuck to his Loyalist guns. The reunited family squatted in the cottage for months until they left for Bermuda, a British colony, in August of 1776. But by this time, they were quite poor and couldn't afford to stay, so they sailed after a few years for England. Their friends had to support them there. After James died in 1780, Joyce and her children became nearly penniless. Let's talk about Elizabeth Hardy. Elizabeth Hardy and her 4 children also suffered for the loyalism of her husband, John. John was taken prisoner by the Patriots 6 different times in 1775. The family eventually joined the British when they surrendered at Yorktown. By then, the Patriots had confiscated and sold the Hardys' entire estate. Some years later, John sailed to England, leaving Elizabeth and their children behind in New York. At some point, Elizabeth and the children arrived in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, British colony, and primary destination for Loyalist refugees. John had apparently abandoned the family. Elizabeth never heard from him again and begged the commission to help support her children. Elizabeth was dragged around from place to place because of her husband's loyalty, and in the end, she suffered greatly for it. The American Revolutionary War forced the losers of the conflict to leave their homes in America, even though many white women, many wives, had very little choice in the matter. So now I'm going to switch it up and do a group activity a little bit here. We'll see if you're more talkative than my students. We'll see. So we're going to do a short primary source activity. Activity is a strong word. We're just going to have a conversation, right? We're going to look at some Loyalist claims that 2 other women made. Okay, the point of this exercise is just to give us insight into Loyalist women's losses, but also to show you that no matter how hard certain people's losses were, if they enslaved other human beings, those enslaved people suffered far worse due to their lack of freedom. Okay, so here's a Loyalist claim. This is a picture I took in the National Archives in London. This is a Loyalist claim from Penelope Forsyth. She's the one I talked about at the very beginning of the paper. This is listing property that she had to burn and property that the Patriots stole from her. So go ahead, read it. Yeah?
Hard to read.
Okay, are you sure? No, it takes a while, I know, but hey, y'all look over the age of 25, so it's very possible you know how to read cursive, okay? So if you know how to read cursive, you're already at an advantage compared to my poor students, okay? So maybe you should figure out the numbers, maybe you can tell that big bold one, and inventory. Maybe you got as far as an inventory, okay?
Bunch of slaves in there.
Yeah, you see, yes. This is primary source, right? A primary source. Okay, well, you're in luck. Boom, baby, I translate. All right, transcribe it for you. Okay. Do you want to go back though? You can keep working on it. No, we're gonna move forward. Okay, so this is my transcription of it, right? So we're gonna just look at this. I'm gonna read it out loud. I want you to understand when I use the word Negro, it's in quotations. It's from a primary source. Okay, that's not a word we use to describe black people today, obviously. So this is an inventory of sundry effects lost and destroyed in Virginia on account of the American Revolution, belonging to the above memorialist. Okay, a schooner burnt by order at Gwynn's Island. Burnt by order means Lord Dunmore is saying we should burn our stuff so the Patriots don't get a hold of it. Okay, 130. That's dollar amount. So it's in pounds sterling at this point, but then also in each one of these it's converted to what's called Virginia currency. Just don't worry about it, okay? But it's just for our purposes, this is a dollar amount, right? Okay. A Negro man, a valuable shoemaker, lost at the Battle of Great Bridge. A valuable Negro woman, a housekeeper and cook. 2 horses worth 30 pounds, a riding chair and harness worth 20 pounds. A trunk of calfskin and bond leather burnt in the schooner. 15 pair of new boots at 3 pounds burnt in ditto, so burnt in the schooner. Remember, these are shoemakers, right? So the calfskin. So the questions I would ask my students, and the questions I'm asking you, is what do you notice about what and who is included as property? Right? You have, in order, a boat, 2 people, 2 horses, and then some items. Okay, so something I want us to just think about when it comes to primary sources during this time period and primary sources that involve enslaved people, this really goes to show you the banality of evil. Okay, it's actually quite boring to imagine listing out all your property, right? Look how simplistic this is, but this is evil, right? So slave ownership is an immoral wrong, right? But we see, if you're a historian, you see these things all the time. And it goes to show you what the mindset was of people living back then. They treated these people as property, and you just have to literally let that sink in when you're reading it, right? Penelope uses the word lost to describe her property. Right, so when we think about the woman, a housekeeper and cook who was lost, then we have a man who is a shoemaker lost at the Battle of Great Bridge. What does lost mean? We don't actually know, okay? We don't actually know what lost means. Does it mean that when the Patriots were coming to take over, burn down the shoe shop, and make them flee for their lives, did that also mean they manhandled some of their enslaved people and literally stole them off with them, grabbed them and, confiscated enslaved people, right? Took them by force, maybe. Lost at the Battle of Great Bridge, okay, well that means he died. And he died at this Battle of Great Bridge, it happens nearby in Virginia. Maybe this man fled due to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which we're going to talk about later, and actually joined up with the British side, right? So actually, maybe this valuable shoemaker ran away, or what historians like to say better, is sought their own freedom, right? Ran away from their enslavers on purpose to seek freedom, and then went and joined the British side, right? Maybe he left on his own accord. We don't know. Okay, so there's some things we can know, and there's some things we can't know. Right? Something else that I want you to kind of sit here with as well. What can you infer about how white people, right, patriots and loyalists view the people they enslaved? They're seen as property. When you think about the man and the woman, think about the actual dollar amounts they have and how a boat is worth more than their lives, or that one woman is equal to 2 horses, a chair, and a harness, right? That's pretty demeaning, that's pretty dehumanizing when your life can have a dollar amount, okay? But this loyalist woman, but patriot women, patriot men, all sorts of early Americans owned enslaved people, okay? So it's not just loyalists, but this is a loyalist claim we're looking at. And loyalists absolutely expected to be compensated by the commission for things and people they owned. Right? And they make no separation. That's really key. They make no separation between human and thing. Right. Let's look at another one. This is a loyalist claim from a woman named Margaret Matthews. This is listing the property that the Patriots stole from her. The top says, schedule to which the annexed memorial refers. Okay, can we read it? Just take a minute, see what you can read.
3 acres of land.
It's extremely impressive. That's small cursive.
Was that rum in the dungeon? Of the same.
My students really have to learn from y'all. They cannot read cursive. This is so impressive to me. Okay.
You know, there's a program going on, right, where the government's hiring seniors to write things in cursive.
Really?
Yes, and to translate them back out of cursive.
Oh my goodness. Well, y'all are already qualified. Okay, don't worry, I transcribed it. Okay, so schedule to which the annexed memorial refers. Again, we see words that we're not going to use in normal talk, but it's primary sources. We have a dwelling house, warehouses, cut houses, stables, 3 acres of land, furniture, merchandise and dry goods, ship stores, rum and puncheons, right? We have 2 black enslaved men named Mungo and James. They're both tradesmen taken by the enemy at Yorktown each. Each of them deemed worth $150 currency. And then we have a woman, Bet, and her 2 children named Bess and Tina. Okay, so this is a rare glimpse into claimants actually naming their enslaved people, right? It's unclear to tell us what that means. Does it mean that they cared for them more than those who didn't name them? Does it simply mean that maybe they only enslaved 2 or 3 people, so of course they knew their name, compared to a massive slave owner who wouldn't know the name of all 300 of her slaves, right? We can't really tell. I think we should not have bleeding hearts too much, thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to name these enslaved people and therefore I miss them emotionally or anything like that. This is about property. This is about compensation.
Well, this one also values the tradespeople, Negro tradespeople at 3x what the other one did.
3x, yes, so that's something.
And that was a skilled shoemaker, the other.
Yes, so you have 2 men who are tradesmen worth more than whatever the labor the woman's doing, right? So the labor that enslaved women are doing is lots of time domestic, very hard labor, kitchen labor, farm labor, garden labor, child care, child rearing, hard labor, but not deemed as worthwhile money-wise as tradesmen who make goods, right, for sale, of course, to profit the owner, right? So Margaret uses the phrase taken by the enemy to describe Mungo and James, right? So taken by the enemy at Yorktown each, right? So the Patriots at Yorktown stole these men from her, right? But do we feel bad for her? This is something, right? Like, so this is something you really need to sit with, is that in her life, the damage of having enslaved people and your house burned down, being taken from you, being ruined by the Patriots is a loss that has ruined her life. But she the whole time has been actively ruining the lives of others whom she's owned, and perhaps they have found new freedom by getting out of her enslavement, right? Whether that means they're joining the British, whether that means they're using the chaos of wartime to take their family and seek freedom to Canadian lines. I don't feel bad for her in particular when it comes to the people, right? This is something with emotion that we have to keep in mind and keep in check as historians as well. Again, banality of evil, right? Slave ownership is an evil, cruel, inhumane thing. But a Margaret Matthews is a woman of her era who just writes it down like it's just another item in the list, okay? Right.
It must have been interesting for the commission or council, or whatever they were called, that received all the claims, to justify, regulate, one person's claim versus another's for the value of people, homes, all the different things. You know, try to balance that out.
Yes, constantly. And the more claims you receive, the more you know average costs and prices and worth of everything.
Or what people think they're worth.
Well, is the value maybe what they paid for it?
Could be.
Is it what they paid for them, or is it paid plus interest? It's more often paid plus interest since the time they purchased these people.
Would it also be possible, just throwing this out, that, two things, by naming all of the people, Mungo, James, Bass, Bet, and Tina, she's trying to play on sympathies, like, I knew these people, they were, and also, the other thing I was looking at is that, is it automatically that the women are valued less because they are women and not necessarily what they could bring to the table for their skills and abilities?
So there's no evidence to showcase using people's names means like feel bad for me more because I care about those people. There's absolutely no evidence for that.
Okay.
This is just property to them, whether they have names or not. And most likely they don't use names, but just because they do use names, oftentimes claimants who lose their enslaved people spend the rest of their life trying to get them back, trying to see where they escaped to. So including names, I think more likely that's like, hey, if you hear, they're mine and I want them back. Yeah. So, and then your second question with enslaved women, this is a complicated question because enslaved women were technically dollar-wise were often less valuable than young, so 20-something healthy adult men who were enslaved people. So for example, by the eve of the Civil War, so 1860, in today's dollar, the going price of a healthy 20-something adult male was about $40,000 in our own money. Okay, so yes, they're worth less because they're women, quote unquote. They're worth less because they're not strong men who are doing farming and doing trades work, right? So there is a gender aspect there. Enslaved women, though, are still highly valued because of their reproductive labor. So hopefully they will have children whom you will own for life as well, right? So they're still valuable, just in a different way. So, okay, we gotta keep moving on. All right, so thank you for that little activity. I am very impressed you can read cursive. It really means a lot to me personally, so thank you. So I want to talk about another group of loyalists you may not have thought about before, and that's thousands and thousands of enslaved people. So white Americans of any political stripe in the colonial era, in the both so-called North and South, enslaved Black Americans and Africans. So during wartime, that meant patriots, loyalists, disaffected, everyone, right? And if you know a little bit of your Vermont history, Vermont is the first colony. It was not an official colony, right? We can get into that some other time, but Vermont was the first region to abolish slavery outright in 1777. So that was during wartime. Pennsylvania was the second colony in 1780. That means this is also happening, this banning is during wartime, but really it was gradual abolition in Pennsylvania, meaning children from that point on were free, but not their parents. So just kind of keep this in mind. We already have northern or mid-Atlantic regions starting to ban or gradually abolish slavery during wartime, right? But my point is reminding you the North and the South, especially the North, still allowed and very much practiced slavery during the American Revolution. Okay, so surely enslaved people would overhear their owners talking about all the uproar about taxes, the war effort, and all of the above, or read this in newspapers, right? So we can absolutely assume enslaved people were in the know about political events, even if we don't have as many written sources from them about their own political or ideological thoughts on these debates. We can imagine they had thoughts, but we can also imagine they didn't have the luxury in the same way their enslavers did to muse about the ideological origins of dissent. Instead, enslaved people were concerned with what would happen to them, their families, and their freedom status come wartime. And wartime did affect enslaved people, especially after 1775. So this is when Lord Dunmore's proclamation was announced. So I mentioned Lord Dunmore earlier, right? I've been going too far. Oh, well, here we go. In April 1775, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore and Virginia's last royal governor, threatened to free slaves and reduce the capital of the colony, Williamsburg, to ashes if the colonists continued to rebel against British authority. So on November 7th, so later, on November 7th, 1775, Dunmore issued a proclamation that established martial law in the colony and offered freedom to enslaved people and white indentured servants who would leave their patriotic masters and join the British Army. So from the document, quote, "I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels free, that are able and willing to bear arms, their joining their Majesty's troops as soon as they may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity," unquote. Within a month, 300 black men had signed up with Dunmore's fleet, right? They're dubbed the Royal Ethiopian Regiment, okay? This was the British, just using a racist terminology. Obviously, none of these African-American men were from Ethiopia directly, but Ethiopia, right, an African country, they're dubbed the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. While the regiment grew to only 800 men, Dunmore's proclamation did inspire more than 20,000 enslaved people to seek freedom behind British lines throughout the Revolutionary War. Although Dunmore's proclamation applied only to Virginia, it was printed in newspapers throughout the 13 colonies, and you know enslaved people are taking it up on it. Just the fact that it is in Virginia only is not going to stop them, right? Keep in mind, some of General Washington's own enslaved people fled to the British side with this. Also, about a year after Dunmore's proclamation, General George Washington of our Continental Army made a very similar proclamation because he realized Dunmore's was so successful. Okay, so George Washington and his kind of commanders at first did not want to offer freedom to enslaved people. They were afraid of putting guns in the hands of enslaved people, given everything white people have done to enslaved people. They feared having those guns used against them. But tactics-wise, they realized Dunmore's proclamation was a strong, smart military tactic, and they followed suit by also offering freedom. Historians estimate about 5,000 enslaved people eventually signed up for the Continental Army and were offered freedom, but compared to, you know, the over 20,000 that either signed up or went to do labor behind British lines, right, of those enslaved people. So 5,000 versus 20,000, you can tell what side enslaved people are going for more, and it's the British side. So, this is a current, kind of like a more modern image based on descriptions that we have of a uniform of the so-called Ethiopian Regiment during the American Revolution, and they did have Liberty for Slaves. They made their own outfits called Liberty for Slaves, and it was a play on the phrase liberty or death that the Patriots were using. Okay, so enslaved people very much understood and pointed out often during the war and especially afterwards the absolute hypocrisy of patriots calling for freedom from the tyranny of British control, all while still holding human beings in slavery, right? Now, historians can explain that. In the George Washington, the Thomas Jefferson's minds of this time period, they view slavery as what's called a necessary evil. This is kind of a transitional thing that I teach to my students. The founding era, founding fathers, slave owning, people who are ideologically committed to kind of the patriotic cause, often recognize, say point blank, slavery is wrong and hypocritical to what we're doing here against the British, but they're still lesser than us. And I personally can't imagine freeing them because I'm making so much money off of them, so hopefully that will be a problem solved later. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why the Founding Fathers put in, there's 3 different clauses in the US Constitution that have to do with slavery, and one of them is banning the transatlantic slave trade in 20 years from now, so that kicks in 1807, 1808. That is their way of trying to ban slavery. Now, it doesn't work, right, because enslaved people domestically have continued to have families and slavery continues, right? There's a whole, okay? So we don't actually have the whole slavery is a positive good. In fact, God wants us to own slaves and slaves want to be enslaved. We don't have those arguments until post-cotton boom of the 1830s, okay? So when you think about kind of those arguments, those are coming way later, okay? But enslaved people during the American Revolutionary era absolutely see the hypocrisy, and we see writings about that, okay? So I don't have much time left, but I do want to leave you with a couple quotes from a man named Boston King. So we have a man named Boston King. He was formerly enslaved, and he fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War, and he secured his freedom through doing so. He wrote about his experience in 1798, so years later, you know, about his journey. He ends up being a Methodist preacher. So I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to try to give you some highlights. This is all kind of direct quotes from his memory. To escape a neighboring enslaver's cruelty, I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before, although I was much grieved at first to be obliged to leave my friends and reside among strangers. In this situation, I was seized with the smallpox and suffered great hardships, for all the blacks affected with that disease were ordered to be carried a mile from the camp, lest the soldiers should be infected and disabled from marching. This was a grievous circumstance to me and many others. We lay sometimes a whole day without anything to eat or drink. But Providence sent a man who belonged to the York Volunteers, whom I was acquainted with, to my relief. He brought me such things I stood in need of, and by the blessing of the Lord, I began to recover. So skipping forward, soon after I went to Charlestown and entered on board of a man of war. We were going to Chesapeake Bay, and we were at the taking of a rich prize. We stayed in the bay 2 days, then sailed for New York, where I went on shore. Here I endeavored to follow my trade, but for want of tools was obliged to relinquish it and enter into service. But the wages were so low that I was not able to keep myself in clothes, so that I was under the necessity of leaving my master and going to another. I stayed with him 4 months, but he never paid me, and I was obliged to leave him also. Master here does not mean slave master, it means someone contracting him for work. And he worked about the town until I was married. A year after, I was taken very ill, but the Lord raised me up again in about 5 weeks. I then went out as a worker in a pilot boat. We were taken by an American whaleboat. My mind was sorely distressed at the thought of being again reduced to slavery and separated from my wife and family. And at the same time, it was exceedingly difficult to escape from the bondage of being contractually obligated on this. Okay, so we're skipping ahead. Here, where do I want to start? Finally, okay, so when I arrived at New York, my friends rejoiced to see me once more restored to liberty. In 1783, the horrors and devastation of war happily terminated, and peace was restored between America and Great Britain, which diffused universal joy among all parties, except us, who had escaped from slavery and taken refuge in the English army. For a report prevailed at New York that all the slaves in number 2,000 were to be delivered up to their masters, although some of them had been 3 or 4 years among the English. This dreadful rumor filled us all with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters coming from Virginia, North Carolina, and other parts, and seizing their slaves in the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. Many of the slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thoughts of returning home with them embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. The English had compassion upon us in this day of distress, and issued a proclamation importing that all slaves should be free, who had taken refuge in the British lines, so it's kind of a secondary one trying to re-up the original Dunmore's claim. And they claimed the sanction and privileges of the proclamations respecting the security and protection of Negroes. In consequence of this, each of us received a certificate from the commanding officer, a British officer at New York, which dispelled all our fears and filled us with joy and gratitude. Soon after, ships were fitted out and furnished with every necessity for conveying us to Nova Scotia. We arrived in August, where we safely landed. Every family had a lot of land, and we exerted all of our strength to build a comfortable hut before the cold weather set in. Unquote. So I read this because it's very important to understand that white loyalists suffered property loss, atrocities, burning of their homes. I haven't even gone into it, but for women, some suffered rape. But that enslaved people often had to turn into loyalists by necessity to gain their freedom, right? So that's always an extra burden and torture that enslaved people had to go through, whereas white loyalists always at least had their freedom. Another group of potential loyalists we haven't even talked about, and we won't have time to talk about necessarily today, are indigenous people in America at the time. The vast majority of indigenous people joined up with the British. The American Revolutionary Wars ending, so the British losing, was incredibly devastating for indigenous communities across this nation. But that's it for me on the historical stuff, so thank you. Happy to answer our Q&A. I also, getting back to the title of this talk, want us to think about why this matters today. So if I could ask the audience, how does any of what I've talked about resonate with you with our current political situation today? Yeah.
So I see actually two parallels in time with what happened here, and I think they actually inform what we see in modern day and what we see post-Civil War, which is a losing party or an aggrieved party trying to create a narrative. I think their failure of the Loyalists to create the narrative post-Revolutionary War inspired the post-Civil War lost cause mythology and all the efforts that went into reclaiming a narrative in the South. And I think we've seen that hyperbolized in modern media, where both sides want to desperately create their own narrative and prepare a narrative in the post of whatever sort of conflict comes about. Because the more pervasive your narrative is during war or conflict, the more likely it is to stick in a post-conflict resolution.
Other thoughts from the audience on that first? This is like the classroom, you gotta speak to each other first and then I'll talk. Yeah, no, I think that's very key. I think that's very smart. Just to briefly tell the audience, like, what's the lost cause mythology, right? Post-Civil War, very, very in brief. It basically is, the South lost the Civil War. They had to free their slaves, right? And lots of historians will show you that they were not properly punished. Lots of leaders of the Confederacy were back in politics pretty quickly after. The whole idea of like reconciliation, let's come back together after this war, let's put our differences aside, enabled Southern leaders to then later kind of create this myth, this narrative, as the gentleman was saying, that we never went to war because of slavery, it was because of states' rights, which of course I tell my students, states' rights to do what? Own people. Yeah. Also, we were inevitably always going to lose the war because the North had so much better manufacturing, and strength like that. Yes, there are some numbers games things that do show that their industry and kind of provisions was stronger in the North, but not so much to cause such a widening, inevitable gap in who's going to win or not. And also, wars are fought and won on battlefields, and the Confederates won many wars and many historians argue, could have easily won the war if certain circumstances on the battlefields were different, right? So this is a contingency of history, right? It's not just that industry was better, it's that battles matter, right? So battles matter, the Confederacy could have won in that sense. There's other parts of the lost cause. Another part of the lost cause mythology is enslaved people were happy. They were better off, actually, in slavery because at least their masters took care of them and clothed them and housed them and fed them, and the old ones didn't have to work anymore. Because look at wage work in the North, right? Isn't that worse for free white people when you're a slave to the industrial barons, right, who are hurting you, and it's just like complete hogwash. But this was absolutely able to flourish as a narrative, a lost cause narrative, because those losers, those believers, were able to have their free speech rights, frankly, and able to, more importantly, get back into government positions. There's a study that came out, and I can try to find the article for you if you're interested, but there's a study that came out that said the biggest slave owners who lost their fortunes once slavery was abolished regained all of their money and worth just one generation later. Okay, so Yeah, so relating this to the Loyalists, that's really interesting. Yeah, so I think what you're saying is that there wasn't this opportunity for the Loyalists to have this aggrieved narrative and to kind of make up certain things about the past, right? So then the lost cause losers of that war maybe saw that and said, no, we gotta create this narrative this time, right?
Well, especially with the overlap that a lot of Loyalists was based in the south of the United
Yes,
States.
yes, many, yes. they
So
were,
essentially,
yes.
a lot of people that probably were the Loyalists of the Revolutionary
Yeah.
War became the Confederacy
Yes,
later on, and
Yes.
then, you know, suffering once,
yes.
but wouldn't suffer the same fate again.
Yes, I think I would agree with that, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious to know the numbers that you mentioned at the beginning about like the disaffected versus like which side. What do historians, like where do they get those numbers from?
Where'd they get those numbers from? Yeah, they basically get them from a wide variety of sources and reading other people's work from like 100 years ago. Like basically just like different census records. They won't actually tell you like affiliation, but census records, if you trace them, you can tell like who has property and then who loses that property and when, right? And if they lose property during a certain time period, you pair that up with maybe like a letter or with something else from that family, then that shows, oh, we were Loyalists, right? Or, oh, we were Patriots. So those kind of come together through a wide variety of sources that have been looked at and published for a long time. So that's not a really great answer for you, I know, but it's not like one historian sat down and was like, I shall find this out. It's like, it's an amalgamation of different findings from like the past 100 years to kind of get at that number. Yeah.
I want to mention that one of the best accounts of a slave entering the Revolutionary cause of the side of the Americans actually has a Vermont connection. It was a man named Boyer Row Branch, Angus Jeffrey Brace. He came to settle in Georgia as well as Sheldon after the war, but he gave a first-hand account of his slavery all the way back to the transatlantic slave, and it's one of maybe 12 first-hand accounts.
We have the book
Which
here.
we sell in our gift shop if anyone here is
So I do
interested.
recommend reading that book. It's
The Blind African Slave,
Yes.
the title.
And it's an amazing account of the American side and what he went through, and even after that, his fight for trying to get his due pension, which he was denied time and time and time again.
Thank you. No, thank you. That's great for audience to know. Yeah.
I wonder how many families were split, Loyalist but one prominent one was Ben Franklin and his son James, who, James went to England. I think he was the governor of New Jersey. And he was a Loyalist, and he and his father, they never spoke again when James left.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I can't tell you I've read anything that's tried to calculate the number of that. I know it happened. It kind of, I think it's probably reminiscent a little bit. We've all heard about how the Civil War, right?
Right.
Brother versus brother, you know. I do think that happened in the American Revolutionary War, though. I have to take a guess, just an educated guess, that it happened far less, because entire family units were usually on one side or the other, and that's based on what Dad did for his job, and his or connection to Britain or not. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think there's a postscript to your story about the Loyalist losses, which you might be able to illustrate far better than I can, but wasn't there a bilateral commission for reparations after the war, in which not only the British were going to pay the Loyalists, but the Americans were going to pay the Loyalists for some of their losses, and the British were going to pay for American losses, which came to collapse when the British refused to return the slaves. And George Washington himself, I believe, got angry about it, and the whole idea that everybody was going to pitch in to give people things back came to naught.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's not a part of my own personal research on the Loyalists, but you are correct, yes, absolutely. That is true. George Washington did not think that Americans were going to give their enslaved people back or anything like that, so yeah, it did collapse, but I'm not an expert on that, but it sounds like you have good information. Huh?
He wanted his chef back.
Oh, yeah, Hercules, yes, of course, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I've done a lot of genealogy, and I know that I have a loyalist who went from Vermont and ended up in the eastern townships. And when I was checking his family out, the rest of them, his parents are buried in Bennington. And, brothers and sisters, they were all, part of probably the Green Mountain Boy group. But, and his wife, it took me quite a while to figure her origins out, but actually her brother married the sister of her husband, so I realized that, and her family was a Hurd family, H-U-R-D, from some of them were in Sandgate and also in Rupert. But I've never heard, anything beyond that particular couple, ended up in Quebec, and the rest of the family was still in Vermont.
So you have some roots to loyalism.
I have Anglo friends in Quebec, and they're very proud of their their loyalists.
Oh, they're loyal, yes, okay.
We have time for 2 more questions that have short answers.
Okay.
But you will be sticking around
Sure.
afterwards
Yes,
for people to
for a little
go and chat more. Okay,
Yes,
great.
just for a little bit, yes. Yes, hi.
Do you have any idea of what percentage of loyalists remained and what percentage left the country?
Rebecca Brandon could probably tell you. She is a historian at James Madison University who wrote about South Carolinian loyalists returning, so she probably has a note about that, but I just can't remember off the top of my head, but I would recommend her book. I don't know percentage-wise. I do know the majority fled, but what does that mean, 70% versus 51%? I'm not quite sure. And it would depend, again, it would just depend on kind of local circumstance if you're able to be welcomed back. So for example, my dissertation that I wrote, that I'm trying to turn into a book, is about one woman named Catherine Flood McCall, who was a child during the American Revolution. And she and her father, her mother died giving birth to her, so she and her father fled during the American Revolution. She was raised in boarding schools in Britain. She and her loyalist father, right, that's the reason they fled, she and her loyalist father were welcomed back to Virginia, and they lived in Tappahannock, Virginia. And they were welcomed back because young Catherine was a child and so could not be blamed for any sort of political persuasion about her dad, and she was the sole inheritor to her dead mother's entire fortune. And so money-wise, they were able to come back and get their house back. That's also because they had an uncle there in Tappahannock who was kind of fighting on their behalf in the courts the whole time. So now when she comes back, are her neighbors actually kind to her father? Actually, yeah. I think there are some, I think there's more stories out there than we might know about, wow, I'm glad this is all over. And you can come back and we'll just accept you kind of back into the fray. Yes?
One of the slaves was named Mungo, and I was wondering what the derivation of that was.
I don't know. I don't know, I just don't know everything, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Before we applaud Dr. Garrett here and thank her, I do want to just make a quick connection to what you were saying to the Homestead site here. I'm just going to scooch over and make sure my voice gets picked up on the microphone. Also as an invitation for everyone in our audience to learn more about some of the Loyalists in Vermont, we do have a new exhibit. It's on the other side of this wall called Voices of the Revolution. And there are 2 Loyalists featured in that exhibit. One is William Marsh and one is Fanny Buchanan, who you might know as Fanny Allen. Who actually died as Fanny Pennyman. So she married many times, but Buchanan was her last name during the Revolutionary War, married to a British officer who died at the Battle of Saratoga, and she grew up in a Loyalist family. And in the exhibit, it does have the primary source where she wrote a letter to the British Army general asking for compensation because her Loyalist husband had died in the battle, and she had to take care of herself and a child and a servant. We don't know anything about that servant, unfortunately. And William Marsh in the exhibit is particularly interesting because he actually fought for the Patriots for the first 2 years of the war. and then he switched to the British side. Because here in Vermont, Vermont had its own war for independence against New York. And so he wanted Vermont to be independent from New York, and he thought, in 1777, he thought, well, the British is the best way to get that, so he switched sides. So please take a look at that. And I think all that Dr. Garrett has said today, and those just two examples of people who are associated here with the Homestead site, really goes to show that there is so much nuance in the Revolutionary War. And though Dr. Garrett's presentation was primarily about Loyalists in the South, please don't think it was just in the South. Right here in the borderland of Vermont, Canada, controlled by the British, just a few miles away, it was the frontier land where people switched back and forth, and loyalism was quite strong here in Vermont as well. So it is definitely a much more nuanced issue here.
And just a quick note on that. I think you asked about families that were split. We forget perhaps that Levi Allen, Ethan's brother,
That's true.
was a traitor.
He was a little
Loyalist had his properties confiscated by the.
I think Levi would have said Ethan was the traitor, to be fair. Yeah, but yes, absolutely. And again, just like the example of your woman down in Virginia, Fanny was welcomed back. She was in a Loyalist family. She was welcomed back into the fold of the American Patriots and married the most famous patriot in Vermont, Ethan Allen. So, yeah, quite a lot.
Can I just make an announcement?
Sure.
Ken Burns is doing a documentary
That's
coming
correct.
up for the American Revolution, and the Atlantic Monthly has a great spread on different people on the
Fabulous.
Revolution, so.
Yes, and I know here in Burlington there'll be a premiere showing of the Ken Burns documentary very shortly. I've told October 29th, but I haven't confirmed that myself yet. And actually, down at Main Street Landing here in Burlington.
November 12th.
Is it November 12th?
Yeah.
Is the Main Street Landing
I got
showing?
that, yeah.
Okay. There's our fact check date guy there. But the person giving the special talk for that premiere showing is Dr. Garrett right here as well.
I'm one of them.
Yeah.
There was a conversation among others.
Yeah, okay. So with that, please, I know you just did a mini applause. Let's do a big round of applause. Coming out and supporting the homestead and to learn a little bit of history. We are a nonprofit, and so there is a donation basket on your way out the door, and there are membership forms at the front desk that Joe would be happy to hand you out. Membership is the best way to give a continuing gift to the museum and to stay up to date in all of our activities. Please check out the exhibit I just talked about. Help yourself to more refreshments. Thanks to Lee and Chris. Thank you so much for being here.